Yo, welcome back to another reading session. I'm not gonna set a timer. I'm just gonna read this book, one chapter probably. I've got a pen, I've got a book. I'm gonna write some notes if I feel like that's necessary. I like to write notes on these books, these types of books, um, like anything with substantial knowledge in that I can take, because I'm studying economics at the moment. So I've read his 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism book, so I thought I'd want to read this book. So here we are. I've read the first chapter. I'm about to start the second chapter. It is called From Pin to Pin. But yeah, let's go. From Pin to Pin. What is the first ever thing written about in economics? Gold, land, banking, or international trade? The answer is the pin. Not the one that you use for your credit cards, but that little metal thing that most of the time you do not use. That is, unless you have long hair or like to keep it tidy or make your own clothes. The pin, the making of the pin, is the subject of the very first chapter of what is commonly, albeit mistakenly, considered to be the first economic book, namely An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. Smith starts his book by arguing that the ultimate source of increase in wealth lies in the increase in productivity through greater division of labor. Smith starts his book by arguing that the ultimate source of increase in wealth lies in the increase in productivity through greater division of labor, which refers to the division of production processes into smaller, specialized parts. He argued that this increases productivity in three ways. First, by repeating the same one or two tasks, workers become good at what they do more quickly. Practice makes perfect. Second, by specializing, workers do not have to spend time moving physically and mentally, between different tasks. Reduction in transition costs. Last but not least, a finer breakdown of the process makes each step easier to be automated and thus be performed at superhuman speed. Mechanization. And to illustrate this point, Smith discusses how 10 people dividing up the production processes of making a pin and specializing in one or two of the sub processes can produce 48,000 pins or 4,800 pins per person a day. Compare this to the most 20 pins each of them can produce a day. Smith pointed out each individual worker performed the whole process alone. Smith pointed out if each individual worker performed the whole process alone. Smith called the pin manufacture a trifling example and later went on to note how more complicated the divisions of labor for other products are, but there is no denying that he lived in a time when 10 people worked together to make a pin was still considered cool, or at least cool enough to front someone would be magnum opus in what then was a cutting-edge subject. The next 2.5 centuries have seen dramatic developments in technology driven by mechanization and the use of chemical processes, not least in the pin industry. 2 generations after Smith, the output per worker had nearly doubled. Following Smith's examples, Charles Babbage, the 19th century mathematician who is known as the conceptual father of the computer, studied pin factories in 1832. Babbage's first computer was called the Difference Engine, which provided the title for one of the classic steampunk sci-fi novels by William Gibson and Bruce Sterling. Where was I? Who was known as the conceptual father of computers. He found that they were producing about 8,000 pins per worker a day. 150 more years of technological progress increased productivity by yet another 100 times to 800,000. Pins per worker per day. According to the 1980 study by the late Clifford Pratton, a Cambridge economist, the increase in productivity by making the same things such as the pin is only one part of the story. Today we can produce so many things that people living in Smith's time could only have dreamt about, such as the flying machine, or could not even imagine, such as the microchip, the computer, the fiber optic cable, and numerous other technologies that we need in order to use our pin. All change. How the actors and the institutions of capitalism have changed. It is not only production technologies or how things are made that have changed between Adam Smith's time and ours. Economic actors, or those who engage in economic activities, and economic institutions, or the rules regarding how production and other economic activities are organized, have also gone through fundamental transformations. The British economy is, in Smith's time, which he called the commercial society, shared some fundamental similarities with those that we find in most of today's economies. Otherwise, his work would be irrelevant. Unlike most other economies of the time, the other expectation being the Netherlands, Belgium, and parts of Italy, it was already capitalist. So what is the capitalist economy, or capitalism? It is an economy which production is organized in pursuit of profit rather than for own consumption, as in subsistence farming, where you grow your own food, or for political obligations, as in feudal societies or socialist economies, where political authorities, respectively aristocrats and the central planning authority, tell you what to produce. Profit in the difference between what you earn by selling something in the market. This is known as sales revenue, or simply revenue. And the costs of all the inputs that have gone into production of it. In the case of the pin factory, its profits would be the difference between the revenue from selling the pins and the cost that is incurred in making them. The steel wire that has been turned into pins, the wages for its workers, the rent for the factory building, and so on. Capitalism is organized by capitalists, or those who own capital goods. Capital goods are known as the means of production and refer to durable inputs into the production process. For example, machines, but not say raw materials. In everyday usage, we use the term capital for the money invested in a business venture. Capitalists own the means of production either directly or, more commonly these days, indirectly, by owning shares or stocks in a company. That is proportional claims on the total value of the company that own those means of production. Capitalists hire other people on a commercial basis to operate these means of production. These people are known as wage laborers, or simply workers. Capitalists make profit by producing things and selling them to other people through the market, which is where goods and services are bought and sold. Smith believed that competition among sellers in the market will ensure that profit-seeking producers will produce at the lowest possible cost, thereby benefiting everyone. However, the similarities between Smith's capitalism and today's capitalism do not stretch much beyond those basic aspects. There are huge differences between the two eras in terms of how these essential characteristics, private ownership or means of production, profit-seeking, wage employment, and market exchange, are translated into realities. Capitalists are different. In Adam Smith's day, most factories and farms were owned and run by single individual capitalists, or by partnerships made up of small number of individuals who knew and understood each other. These capitalists were usually personally involved in production, often physically on the factory floor, ordering their workers about, swearing them, and even beating them up. Today, most factories are owned by and operated by unnatural persons, namely corporations. These corporations are persons only in the legal sense. They are in turn owned by a multitude of individuals who buy shares in them and part own them. But being a shareholder does not make you a capitalist in the classical sense. Only 300 of Volkswagen's 300 million shares does not entitle you to fly to its factory entitle you to fly to its factory in, say, Wolfsburg, Germany, and order your workers about in your factory for 1/1,000,000th of their working time. Ownership of the enterprise and control of its operations are largely separated in the largest enterprises. Today's owners in most large corporations have only limited liabilities. In a limited liability company, LLC, or a public limited company, PLC, if something goes wrong with the company, shareholders only lose the money invested in their shares, and that is it. In Smith's time, most company owners had unlimited liabilities, which meant that when their business failed, they had to sell their own personal assets to pay back the debts, failing which they ended up in a debtor's prison. A small number of companies engaged in risky adventures of national significance, such as colonial expansion, the East India Companies of Britain and the Netherlands. Smith was against the principle of limited liability. He argued that those who manage limited liability companies without owning them are playing with other people's money. His phrase in the title of the famous play and then 1991 movie starring Danny DeVito. So the phrase is other people's money, and thus won't be as vigilant in their management as those who have to risk everything they have. Companies are organised very differently from in Smith's days too. Whatever the ownership form, in Smith's days, more companies were small with the one production site under a simple command structure made up of few foremen and ordinary workers and perhaps a caretaker, which is what the hired manager was called then. Today, most companies are huge, even employing tens of thousands or even millions all over the world. Walmart employs 2.1 million, whilst McDonald's, including franchises, employs around 1.8 million people. They have complicated internal structures variously made up of divisions, profit centers, semi-autonomous units, and whatnot, hiring people with complicated job specifications and pay grades within a complex bureaucratic command structure. Workers are different too. In Smith's time, most people did not work for capitalists as wage labourers. The majority of people still worked in agriculture, even in Western Europe, where capitalism was then most advanced. A small minority of them worked as wage labourers for agricultural capitalists, but most of them were either small subsistence farmers, subsistence farmers or tenants, those who pay rent and pay a proportion of their output in return, of aristocrat landlords. During this era, even many of those who worked for capitalists were not wage labourers. There were still slaves around, like tractors, or traction animals. Slaves were means of production owned by capitalists, especially in the plantation owned in the American South, the Caribbean, Brazil, and elsewhere. It was 2 generations after the publication of The Wealth of Nations. The slavery was abolished in 1833 in Britain. It was nearly a century after TWON, which is the book written by Adam Smith, and after a bloody civil war that slavery was abolished in the US, 1862. 30 years later, it doesn't say that, but 30 years later after Britain. Brazil abolished it in only 1888, another 20 years later, 26. While a large proportion of people who worked for capitalists were not wage labourers, many wage labourers were people who wouldn't be allowed to become wage labourers today. They were children. Few thought that there was anything wrong with hiring children. In his 1724 book, A Tour Through the Whole Island of Great Britain, author Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, expressed his delight at the factory that in Norwich, then a centre for cotton textiles, the very children after 4 or 5 years of age could everyone earn their own bread. Thanks to the 1700 ban on the import of calicos, the then prized Indian cotton textile, child labourers subsequently became restricted and then banned. But that was generations after Adam Smith's death in 1790. Today, in Britain and other rich countries, the picture is completely different. In most developing countries in which capitalism is still underdeveloped, the situation is not too dissimilar from that found in Western Europe in Smith's time. In the poorest, child labour is still prevalent, which a lot of people are still tenants of semi-feudal landlords. Anything between 30 and 90% of the workforce in these countries may be self-employed, many of whom are engaged in subsistence farming. Children are not out of work, except for limited hours for a limited range of things, such as paper rounds. There are no legal slaves. Of the adult workers, around 10% are self-employed, that is, they work for themselves. 15-25% work for the government, and the rest are wage labourers and working for capitalists. Markets have changed. In Smith's time, markets were largely local or at most national in scope, except in key commodities that were traded internationally, sugar, slaves, or spices. In a limited range of manufactured goods, for example, silk, cotton, and woolen clothes, these markets were served by numerous small-scale farms, resulting in a state that economists use these days called perfect competition, in which no single seller can influence the price. For people from Smith's time, it would have been impossible to even imagine companies hiring over twice than the size of London's population, 0.8 million in 1800, operating in territories that outnumbered the then British colonial territories around 20 by a factor of 6. McDonald's operates in over 120 countries. Today, most markets are populated and often manipulated by large companies. Some of them are only supplier monopoly, or typically one of the few suppliers oligopoly, not just at the national level but increasingly at the global level. For example, Boeing and Airbus supply close to 90% of the world's civilian aircrafts. Companies may also be the sole buyer, Sony, or one of the few buyers, Sony. Unlike the small companies in Adam Smith's world, monopolistic or oligopolistic firms can influence market outcomes. They have what economists call market power. A monopolistic firm may deliberately restrict its output to raise its prices to the point that its profit is maximized. I explained the technical points in Chapter 11, feel free to ignore them now. Oligopolistic firms cannot manipulate their markets as much as the monopolistic firms can, but they may deliberately collude to maximize their profits by not undercutting each other's prices. This is known as a cartel. As a result, most countries now have a competition law, sometimes called an antitrust law, in order to counter such anti-competitive behaviors, breaking up the monopoly. For example, the US government broke up AT&T, the telephone company, in 1984 and banning collusion against oligopolistic firms. Monosonistic and oligosonistic firms were considered to be theoretical curiosities even a few decades ago. Today, some of them are even more important than monopolistic and oligopolistic firms in shaping our economy, exercising their powers as one of the few buyers of certain products, sometimes on a global scale like Walmart, Amazon, Tesco, and Carrefour, exercise great, sometimes even defining influence on what gets produced where, who gets how big of a slice of profit, what consumers buy. Money. The financial system has also changed. We now take for granted that countries have only one bank that issues its notes and coins, that is, the central bank, such as the US Federal Reserve Board or the Bank of Japan. In Europe, in Adam Smith's time, most banks and even some big merchants issued their own notes. These notes, or bills, issued in the US, were not notes in the modern sense. Each note was issued to a particular person, had a unique value, and was signed by the cashier issuing it. It was only in 1759 that the Bank of England started issuing fixed denominations notes. The £10 note in this case, the £5 note only came in 1793, 3 years after Adam Smith died, and it wasn't until two generations after Smith, 1853, the fully printed notes, with no name of the payee and no signature by issuing cashiers were issued. But even these fixed denomination notes were not notes in the modern sense, as their values were explicitly linked to the precious metals like gold or silver that the issuing bank possessed. This is known as gold or silver or other standard. The gold-silver standard is a monetary system in which paper money is issued by the central bank, is freely exchangeable with a specified weight of gold or silver. This did not mean that the central bank had to have in reserve an amount of gold or equal to the value of the currency it issued. However, the convertibility of paper money into gold made it necessary for it to hold a very large gold reserve. For example, the US Federal Reserve Board kept gold equivalent to 40% of the value of currency it issued. The result was that the central bank had little discretion in deciding how much paper money it could issue. The gold standard was first adopted in Britain in 1717 by Isaac Newton, the then head of the Royal Mint, and adopted by the other European countries in 1870s. So that's a while later. This system played a very important role in the evolution of capitalism in the next 2 generations, but that is subject for later, see chapter 3. Use of banknotes is one thing, but saving with and borrowing from banks, namely banking, is another. This was even less developed. Only a small minority had access to banking. 3/4 of the French population did not have access to the banks until 1860s, nearly a century after TWN. Even in Britain, whose banking history was far more developed than that of France, banking was highly fragmented, with interest rates being different in parts of the country well into the 20th century. Stock markets, where companies' shares, stocks, how bought and sold, has been in existence for a couple of centuries or so by Adam Smith's time, but given that the few companies issued shares, as mentioned above, there was only a small number of limited liability companies. The stock market remained a sideshow to the unfolding capitalist drama. Worse, many people considered stock markets to be a little more than gambling dens. Some would say they still are. Stock market regulation was minimal and hardly enforced. Stockbrokers were not obliged to reveal much information about the company whose shares they were selling. Other financial markets were even more primitive. The government for bonds, that is IOU, that can be transferred to anyone, issued by the government borrowing money, the very market that is the centre of the Euro crisis that's shaken the world since 2009, existed only in a few countries such as Britain, France, and the Netherlands. The market for corporate bonds, IOUs issued by companies, was not very developed in Britain. Today we have highly developed, some would say overdeveloped, financial industry. This is made up of not just the banking sector and the stock market and the bond markets, but increasingly the markets for financial derivatives, futures, options, swaps, and the alphabet soup of composite financial products like MBS, CDO, and CDS. Don't worry, I'll explain this later in chapter 8. The system is ultimately backed by the central bank, which acts as a lender of last resort and the lends without limits during financial crisis when no one else wants to lend. Indeed, the absence of central banks made the management of financial panic very difficult in Smith's time. Unlike in Smith's time, today there are lots of rules on what actors in the financial markets can do, how many multiples of their equity capital they can lend, what kind of information about themselves companies selling shares need to reveal, what kind of assets different financial institutions are allowed to hold. For example, pension funds are not allowed to hold risky assets. Despite this, the multiplicity and complexity of financial markets have been made their regulation difficult, as we've learned since the 2008 global financial crisis. Concluding remarks: real world changes and economic theories. As these contrasts show, capitalism has undergone enormous changes in the last 2.5 centuries. While some of the Smith's basic principles remain valid, they do so only at very general levels. For example, competition among profit-seeking firms may still be the key driving force of capitalism, as in Smith's scheme, but it's not between small anonymous firms which accepting consumer tastes fight it out by increasing the efficiency in the use of given technology. Today, competition is among huge multinational companies with the ability not only to influence prices but to redefine technologies in a short span of time. Think about the battle between Apple and Samsung and to manipulate consumer taste through brand image building and advertising. However great an economic theory may be, it is specific to its time and space to apply it fruitfully. Therefore, we require good knowledge of the technological and institutional forces that characterize the particular markets, industries, and countries that we're trying to analyze with the help of the theory. This is why we are understanding different economic theories in their right context. We need to know how capitalism has evolved. This is the task we turn to the next chapter. The next chapter is chapter 3, how we have got here, or how have we got here? A brief history of capitalism. So that was a good chapter. Yeah, that was a very good chapter. I didn't write any notes, which is not good, but I'm going to write some now. But that was good. That's it. Peace.